Well, nearly 45 years ago, I went to California on a business trip, and there I had the privilege of going to Disneyland and to Universal Studios. And you might be surprised, but I actually was more impressed with Universal Studios than I was with Disneyland. I found it fascinating to hear the history of where some of the films that I had seen on the movie theater actually had taken place, to see some of the scenes where John Wayne movies were filmed, where Rock Hudson and Doris Day movies were filmed, and where Psycho was filmed. And the person that took us on the tram ride through Universal Studios was, of course, scripted with a lot of funny facts, such as Rock Hudson fishing in a little pond, supposed to be a sports specialist and selling sporting goods, but had never been fishing before in his life. And they stocked this little pond with something like 7,000 trout. And it took Rock Hudson 3 days to catch one. And they told many stories like that. And they talked about the house up on the hill being the house where Psycho was filmed. And he said, "You see those paths going up behind the house? Those are the Psycho paths." Uh, and there was a number of funny things like that. We came to a Western scene, and it was a scene where John Wayne had been the star of one of the movies, and he said, "How do you like this Western town?" And we were driving right through and saw livery stables on one side and saloons on the other, and country stores, etc. And then he pulled around after about a quarter of a mile of roadway. He pulled around behind, and this Western town was nothing but a facade. Now, that's where I'm going with today's lesson, and I want you to know that I do know how to pronounce it. It's spelled F-A-C-A-D-E, and it would look like it would be facade, but actually it's pronounced facade, and its definition is a false appearance. And that's exactly how this Western town was. It was a facade. The front of it gave an appearance that it was an actual town, but in fact it was nothing but storefronts being propped up by 2x4s in the back, and there was nothing behind the facade. Well, in chapter 7, we're dealing with exactly that kind of a situation. In chapter 7 of Zechariah, we find that the temple has been half completed, and some of the returning Israelites have come to the priests to ask if they need to continue to have the fasting 4 times a year. They were fasting for 4 events that went around the fall of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple, and the governor being killed and the people taken captive. So 4 times a year they would fast. That means to abstain from food or drink, and to weep and cry in remembrance of those events that occurred that brought about the 70 years of time of captivity with the Babylonians. Well, the answer that they got was quite an interesting answer. The answer was, "Did you fast unto me, or did you fast unto yourselves?" Well, what did he mean by that? Well, the question was, were you fasting because of the reason those events occurred and your disobedience to me, or did you fast because of the loss that you had in your lives and in the property of your possessions? What were you fasting for? Were you fasting for the loss? Were you fasting for the disobedience to me that caused the loss? A great question for all of us to ask ourselves when we fast and when we pray. Are we fasting and praying unto the Lord because of our disobedience or the disobedience of our nation? Or are we fasting and praying because of the loss that we're having? I couldn't help but think about that as it relates to today in the fact that we had these riots and demonstrations and all of that. And all of us are appalled by both the conduct of the police officers and the injustices that have been portrayed on the blacks and minorities of our country. And I'm appalled by that. And I'm also appalled by the rioting and the destruction of property. But if I were to fast about it, am I fasting because of the loss? Or am I fasting because of the injustice of it and the ungodliness of it? Am I fasting unto God? And that's certainly the question that I think we need to ask ourselves. It's good that we are being brought to be more aware of the injustices and some of the partiality that is shown to some people, and the prejudice and bigotry and hatred that is happening. It's not just happening to blacks, it's not just happening to Hispanics, it's happening to a lot of the poverty-stricken people. A lot of injustices occur to veterans that are living on the streets and other homeless people. It's not just a black or Hispanic issue, it's an injustice issue, it's a preconceived stereotype of certain people. And when we come through this, will we have learned our lesson and put into place the protections that are necessary for everyone to get justice and for everyone to get fair treatment and for everyone not to be stereotyped? Or will we be fasting just because of the loss of businesses and cars and towns and those kinds of things? Well, one of the things that the Lord did in this particular chapter, as he challenges them, what did they fast for? He says, have you gone back and looked at how I blessed the nation of Israel and Jerusalem? But because of your disobedience, because of your hardened hearts, I allowed you to be dispersed. Now, I think it would be really wise if everybody that watches this message and ever hears this message would post Zechariah chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. For it's what God calls us all to, black, white, Hispanic, minority of any kind. He calls us to these standards found in verses 8 through 12, all of us. And if we would keep these standards, we wouldn't have the division and the problems that we have in America today. So let's read through chapter 7, Zechariah, verses 8 through 12. Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, thus has the Lord of hosts said, dispense true justice, practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother. And do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears from hearing, not hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts had sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. We've talked about this sin cycle before, but doesn't it seem to apply to today? What if every person who is bigoted and who is racist and every person who has hatred in his heart were to look at these verses and take them to heart? What if they would recognize that God can bring his wrath on all of us? What if we were to take every one of us, those that are prejudiced and bigoted, those that are rioting and destroying, and we were to apply these lessons to our lives? Maybe we could stop this cycle. Maybe we could stop this hatred and division. We'll never agree on everything. There's no question about that. And certainly there are going to always be people that feel that they're not getting a fair treatment. And there'll always be those who are taking advantage of their brothers and sisters. But wouldn't it go a long way if we just did our best to try to live out what God has called the people to do? Here we are 500 years before Christ, and we still haven't learned the lesson of treating one another as we should and recognizing that we're all brothers, that we are all God's children, and that we're to treat each other with respect and dignity. And we're not to destroy other people's property just because we didn't get our way. We need to go ahead and find a way to bring about justice, to bring about reform, and we need to be sure that we don't always answer injustice with more injustice. Martin Luther King has said some wonderful things about how violence and injustice will never fix the problem, and he's absolutely correct. But at the same time, we can't keep forgetting these lessons. We've got to bring about fairness and justice for all people in America. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.